Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Library. I'm really thrilled to be here with Dr. Rachael Cobb from Suffolk University to talk about the voting rights and the democratic legitimacy and all kinds of interesting talking points that we hear in the news a lot. So I will get to Rachael in just a second. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to the Friends of the Ashland Library who support all of our adult programming. We couldn't do this without them. Also, I'd like to thank the libraries that have partnered with us on this program. I feel like when libraries get together, we make some magic. So I'd like to thank and welcome the patrons from Canton, Danvers, Dedham, Dracut, Needham, Newton, Norwood, Somerville, Stowe, Tewksbury, Watertown, Wayland, and West Newbury. Yeah, people were really interested in this particular topic, and I was really glad to have so many libraries jump onto it. Rachael has a presentation. She's going to be talking for about 20-30 minutes, and then we will take questions at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A. If you have chat or tech issues, please put them in the chat, and I will be paying attention to that. So without further ado, I would like to say that this is the second time I've hosted Dr. Rachael Cobb from Suffolk University, and she's fabulous. I think I actually saw you on some news program at some point a couple of years ago, talking about what you talk about. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's at Suffolk. So I had to reach out, and she just really has been incredibly gracious. So again, she's the chair and associate professor of government at Suffolk University, and she specializes in U.S. elections, election administration, electoral politics, civic engagement, and political participation. So you can see why she is the perfect person to have this conversation. Welcome, Rachael. Thank you so much for being back with us.
Good morning, Mina, and good morning to everyone. And thank you so much for having me back. It is really a pleasure to be here and to be here with all of you today. A little bit about my background and how I got into this long ago, back in when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I was a newly minted Ph.D. and I had planned to do my work going forward on parties, groups, and movements, and looking at the intersection of all of those things and how they connected to each other. And then in the end of the semester, in May of 2006, my department chair at the time asked me to apply for a grant from the United States Election Assistance Commission. The United States Election Assistance Commission had just been created as of 2002, when Congress passed the Help America Vote Act. And the United States Election Assistance Commission was in charge of many things, but one of the things that they wanted to do was address what at the time was a nationwide shortage of poll workers. And so one of the small provisions in it was that colleges develop college poll worker programs. So the sort of short story is I called the city of Boston, and the city of Boston at the time was under a memorandum of understanding from the United States Justice Department for being out of compliance with the Voting Rights Act section on language minorities. They wanted to have a new pool of poll workers come in. And so they were eager to partner with Suffolk University. So thus we founded the University Pollworkers Project, and we recruited students to serve as poll workers. And that was kind of my entree into the world of election administration. And from then on, I was hooked ever since. But I have now been responsible at Suffolk University for helping to recruit students to serve as poll workers and for helping them navigate what election administrators do, the kinds of constraints that they're under, the challenges that they face, and the group of problem solvers around them who are trying to help to make elections better, to make them better in terms of how they're administered, to make them better in terms of the voter experience, and to make them better in terms of having a variety of ways that people can access the electoral process. So that's the backdrop to here we are in 2022. And we have a challenge before us where what we even think of as elections and what they're outcome is in question. So I'm just making sure that I am moving my PowerPoint forward here. What I want to ask today is the impact that distrust has on democracy itself. And I guess before we begin there, let's talk about democracy and what it is, and why we even have elections in the first place. So why have elections? Well, we have elections because the idea of democracy is that that the people elect representatives so that we can have self-government. The will of the people is serving the self-government is serving the will of the people. So it's kind of this cycle, at least theoretically. So then the question is, when we have an election, we have an outcome to the election. And as democratic theorists or people who think about what the core of democracy is, in order for an election to be successful, first of all, it has to be accurate. But people also, regardless of well, not even regardless, but when we think about the outcome, we have to have confidence in it. So the next question is, what causes confidence in elections? And Charles Stewart, who's a professor of political science at MIT and really one of the national experts on election administration, says that the research on voter confidence tells us two things. One, if you want to increase someone's confidence in election, you make sure they have a good experience when they vote, and you make sure their candidate wins. So let's unpack what voter confidence is. Broadly speaking, voter confidence is confidence in democratic institutions, meaning that we think about, like, are our democratic institutions effective? What our institutions are doing, making people feel as if their government is working for them. So if we have confidence, we have trust and we have faith in the political system writ large. We have trust and faith in our political parties to carry out the agendas, the policy agendas that our politicians have. And we also, when we ask the question of effectiveness, we understand that confidence is causing us to, if we have confidence, then we believe that the outcome is legitimate. So let's unpack this even further. What I just said is we have confidence in outcomes, but the other question is the process itself. We have the confidence that the outcome is itself what we expect it to be. But the other one is, did the process lead to the correct outcomes? So the process itself, meaning the voter experience. Do we think that the voting machines are accurate? Do we believe that the behavior of election officials is such that they have behaved with integrity, they have followed the rule of law? And also, is there the fairness of the rules to cast a ballot? So when I go to cast a ballot, when I go into the voting booth, am I feeling as if no one is standing behind me, telling me what to do? That when I put my ballot through the voting machine, I believe that it will be counted, all of those things. So confidence is both the confidence in the outcome, but also confidence in the process itself, the rules of the game, the way, the design of the system, such that at the end of the day, we have confidence in the result. So what causes voter confidence? As I said, not only the voter experience, but also it turns out from all of these surveys that we have done, it is also about who wins. So that if your candidate wins, you have greater confidence. And I'm going to talk about that. The other final piece is elite cues. So what is that? Elite cues are what the winners and the losers are telling us about what just happened in the election and how we should respond. So they are activating our emotions to tell us how to respond to what just happened. So for example, Hillary Clinton in 2016 did question at times, because she won the popular vote, but not the Electoral College, weighed in with some questioning about the legitimacy of the outcome. It wasn't a full rejection of the legitimacy, but it was enough to activate people to feel uncomfortable about it. Donald Trump has most certainly activated emotions within his supporters that have told people that the election was rigged, that it was fraudulent, and that there were all kinds of inaccuracies that led to an outcome that was against what he wanted. So those elite cues play a critical role in the confidence that we as citizens have about the outcome of an election. So those are the three things that we want to unpack today. Again, I ask, what causes voter confidence? The voter experience, who wins, elite cues. I'm just now underlining these things. For voting experience, a voter can have a very negative experience voting. If the voter encounters poorly trained poll workers who seem like they don't know what they're doing, or if they're rude, or if they're discriminatory in some way, that can lead to a very negative voting experience that can make people really question the legitimacy of the election. If they have to wait in line for a really long time, they think these people don't know what they're doing, this is a poorly run event, I don't have confidence in it. And then the other thing that is super important is that whenever we introduce a new thing, I mean, really in any part of our life, when something is new, the iPhone is new, the pen is new, technology is new. When new technology comes along, there is sort of automatic distrust of that technology, that in some way that technology has not been tested, it's not accurate, it's problematic. And so we often have to go through a couple of iterations with a piece of technology in order to ultimately feel as if we are confident in the technology being able to do what we hope it will do. When we think about who wins, if you supported the winner, as I noted, you have higher levels of confidence in the outcome. And if you supported the loser, you feel lower levels of confidence in the outcome. And we see that in poll after poll after poll. And then finally, our elites tell us how to feel, and they activate our attitudes. So in 2016, when we asked, there's also a racial component to this, when we asked voters if they were very or somewhat confident in the outcome of the election, 95% of white voters were confident, but only 85% of African-American voters were confident. And partisanship also plays a role. And I'm going to say a lot more about this in a moment. But in 2004, 2006, and 2014, Democratic voters were less confident than were Republican voters. The outcome of those elections favored the Republicans, and Democratic confidence increased in 2008 and 2012 when Obama became president, and Republican confidence fell. So there is both a partisan reaction and a racial reaction to the confidence that your vote was counted in the manner. So that leads to this issue of legitimacy. And where we start with legitimacy is, do we accept loss? Do we accept that we lost something? And the other piece of legitimacy is that if an election is legitimate, the idea is that every eligible voter who wishes to participate has adequate opportunity to cast a ballot that will be fairly counted. You can unpack all of those items. Every eligible voter, what does that mean? Who wishes to participate? So every eligible voter who wishes to participate, not who must participate or who does, but who wants to participate, has adequate opportunity, not full opportunity, just adequate opportunity to cast a ballot that will then be fairly counted. If those conditions essentially exist, then we often conclude that we had a legitimate election. Legitimacy is further reinforced when the losing candidate or the parties affirm the results of the election. And some here might remember that in 2000, the election was contested when it came down to Florida between Bush versus Gore. And it went through many court cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. The ultimate knowledge of who the president would be did not come to be known until December of 2000. But ultimately, Al Gore went forward and he conceded the election. He made statements saying, well, I don't like the outcome. I concur that this is the outcome. And that statement and the statements of losers across the country in elections, the thousands of elections that we have every year, help us to maintain a confidence in free and fair elections. And they aid in a peaceful transfer of power. I should say at the outset, and I should have said, we do have elections all the time in the United States. We have more elections than in any other country in the entire world. And we have varying amounts of participation in all of these elections, but most of them go uncontested for the outcome. Sometimes we have recounts, and often those recounts are done, and then people accept the outcome, even if they don't like it. So these are key pieces, that middle one being that every eligible voter has the opportunity to participate and that the ballot will be fairly counted. That's sort of the precondition for it. But on either side of it is this idea that the losers are participants in reinforcing the legitimacy that the election that just took place was an election that was done with integrity. So to further go into this, before the 2020 election, 40% of both Democrats and Republicans said they would not accept a win by the candidate from the other party, 40%. And so my point here is that this is not the questioning of the legitimacy and the confidence that people have in elections is something that is shared between members of opposite political parties rather than something that is solely in the hands of one political party or the other. And in fact, just before the 2020 election, the modal Democrat or Republican said that they believed their candidate could only lose if the election were rigged. So going into a little bit more of sort of democratic theory here, an authority is deemed to be legitimate to the extent that the publicly recognized marks of authority, their degree, their position, their credential, their role, is backed by the conditions that indicate competence, training, good judgment, concern for the best interests of those positioned as principals to it. A bad boss is a less legitimate boss. So voter confidence in our election system is crucial because elections are that link between citizens and their elected official. In a representative democracy, it is the ballot box that allows us to send our elected leaders mandates for policies and to hold them accountable. And critically, if voters don't have confidence that their vote is counted correctly, then the most fundamental aspect of our representative democracy, the direct election of its leaders, is in doubt. So now we are confronted with this other issue of false information that has, I must say, this is the idea that there is false information in elections is nothing new. It goes back to the beginning of time. But what has happened recently is the speed with which false information can be spread and disseminated. And I'll begin by stating that false information causes harm. false information is not neutral. False information is highly problematic. It causes struggle for us as citizens, as consumers of information. What is true? How do we know what's true? Does the vaccine work or does it hurt us? Was this person elected legitimately, or are these people trying to hurt me? So the idea that we are questioning information and that it is a struggle for us is something to take very seriously, and really consider the ways in which we can sort of bring down the volume and ensure that people are getting information that is shared, and that we believe. False information is so salient today. It's something that we're talking about all the time because it is so easy to publicize and disseminate. And it is problematic because, number one, the false claims about election fraud in 2020 led to the assault on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. False claims about COVID led the rejection of the vaccine and ingesting toxic substances. False claims about Dominion's voting machines led to threats against the company and weakened trust in the democratic process. So false information has a direct link to downstream violence. And so it is a grave concern for all of us. So let's unpack trust and what that means. So historically, there has been a gap in confidence between Democrats and Republicans. What's odd recently, essentially, is that in the 2020 election, and I'm going to say more about this in just a moment, there was an unusually big increase in trust from Democrats in the outcome of the election. Like, it really bumped up. And there was a modest decrease for Republicans. Republicans in states that Trump lost were much less confident when more votes were cast by mail. So the modality of the election of how people voted itself had impact. And in a paper by Jesse Clark and Charles Stewart III, they found that most states that use the most number of absentee ballots, the confidence gap grew the most. So let's look at the historic gap in trust. And I'm going to walk through each one here. The winner-loser gap. So before the election in 2008, 42% of McCain's voters said they were very confident their own vote would be counted as intended. After the election, that number went down to 23%. Before the election, 11% of Obama voters were very confident that their own vote would be counted as intended. And after the election, that went up to 39%. So in fact, what's interesting here is that the before for the Republicans and the after for the Democrats are actually very similar. Let's look at the 2016 election, the winner-loser gap. Before the election, 29% of Trump voters were very confident that their vote would be counted. After the election, that went up to 58%. So the winner effect increases the confidence. Before the election, 58% of Clinton voters were very confident, and after the election, 64.7%. So it's a small increase, but it's an increase rather than a decrease. But one of the interesting, if we unpack it a little bit more, in 2016, Democrats who lived in states where Clinton barely lost were 19% points less confident than Democrats living in states Clinton barely won. And then in 2020, before the election, 8% of Trump voters were very confident that their own vote would be counted as intended. After the election, it went up to 8.5%. But look at this, before the election, 24.1% of Biden voters were confident, and after the election, 72.8%. So one of the things we want to try to understand even more is like, why are these numbers jumping around so much? And one of the things is that the voting modality, i.e., are you voting by mail, are you voting in person? They found that for Democrats, if Trump lost a state, there was no correlation between the confidence in either his vote share or the percentage of votes cast by mail. However, if Trump won, Democrats were more confident if Trump won by a large margin, or if a large fraction of votes were cast by mail. And Democrats in states that Biden won in 2020 were even more confident of their state's vote count and the vote count of the whole nation if the state had a high volume of mail ballots. So again, there's this intersection of partisanship, voting modality, but where is all of this coming from? A lot of it is coming from these elite cues from on high about exactly how voters should be thinking. I don't know if there hadn't been this discussion of you can't trust mail ballots or the drop boxes or all of that stuff. If the attention on it in a trust kind of way had not been laser-like focused on vote by mail ballots and their partisanship of that, would these numbers be dramatically different? So I end with the idea of what can we do, and in order, as political scientists, we do think about solutions, but we also need to really understand the nature of the problem. And so I don't know that this is a problem, but it is the nature of the way things are run in the United States. Elections are hyper decentralized, i.e., it's not that we have one giant election for president. We have 50 states administering elections in 50 different ways. And even below that, we have counties administering elections in a bunch of different ways. And even below that, we have cities and towns administering elections in a bunch of different ways with different rules in different states. And even by county, there's a difference in ballot design. There's a difference in sometimes how the rules are carried out and implemented. And the other thing that is unique to American elections is that the people who are running the elections, especially at statewide offices, are more often than not partisans. And so there is a uniquely partisan bent to this rather than professionalized independent bodies who are running our elections. And in a hyper-polarized, hyper-partisan era, one would imagine that when partisans are running the show and setting the rules of the game, the trust in the rules of the game are completely activated by the partisanship of the elected officials. So when we have different counties, cities that adopt different policies, the claim that the process is corrupt will arise. When partisan election officials, fear to favor partisan allies, the claims that the process is corrupt will arise. And we have these national institutions to administer national elections. That is something that other democracies have with these professionalized independent institutions. And in our country, it is uniquely partisan. So I end by saying that disinformation and false information does not in and of itself invalidate an election. Disenfranchisement invalidates an election only when it exists on a large scale enough to affect the election's outcome. This is separate from, is it wrong? Disenfranchisement is wrong. But it does not invalidate an election unless we think that it is so egregious that it has caused a different outcome than would have happened otherwise. So we want to focus on the process. We want to try to perfect the process. But the big picture that I hope we can all try to rally around is whether the democratic will of the people was served, and how do we get to that? So there are all kinds of efforts now underway to combat election disinformation, news literacy to help preserve democracy, all kinds of things to empower local media, to empower organizations to be able to provide solid information to voters. But one of the things that we have to do is really come together and understand that our democracy is on us. It's a collective effort on us to make it possible. And that means engagement. That means engagement in terms of serving as poll workers. It means engagement in terms of following the news and reading a diverse set of news. And it means engagement in terms of engaging with our fellow citizens, regardless of party, and listening to their needs and their interests and their thoughts, and building these important bridges and constructive dialogue. There are also all kinds of policies that we can put into place, but at the end of the day, the faith in the policies is coming from people who need to also have faith in each other. So I'm going to end the slide portion of my discussion there.
Thank you, Rachel. That was amazing. Just such a great foundation for the questions that we have. So I'm starting to get some questions in the Q&A, and I have a couple of my own to start. So the last thing you said about the dialogue and the engaging with each other, because it feels like we've gotten to a point where violence is like it has happened, and there isn't, there's chatter about it. Does it feel like it's too late for that? Or, how can we understand why people are thinking differently from ourselves?
Well, it's in ways the $1 million trillion question. First of all, it's never too late. It's too late but repair, reconstruction, reconciliation I think those are the words that we need to be thinking about, and how we engage in that. We think, increasingly scholars of American politics are turning to our friends who are comparativists and international relations people to say, like, okay, what happens in these countries where you have deep ethnic conflict, and where you've had wars, and where you've had terrible violence and strife? And in those countries, we have seen them, in some cases, not in all, right, but in some cases, really heal and find ways to build bridges. But that's where I think that's a collective effort that in some ways has nothing to do with elections, but has to do with having, summer camps for kids from Democratic households and Republican households, and having non-political discussions. One of the other things that's happened is we're so polarized, but we're also so geographically isolated. We are more segregated and more disconnected. There's a new book, relatively new book by an economist called The Loneliest Century, saying that we are more, in this time of connection, we are more lonely and feeling more disconnected than ever before. So the task, it seems to me, is to build those relationships and those bridges and those connections in non-political ways. Again, I can go on, so you can stop me, but I'll say a couple of other things. One of the other research projects that I've been part of is a research project that looked at historical civic groups and their participation. And they had all kinds of things that were bad about them. They were racist, they were sexist, they were, in that sense, terrible. And yet they were cross-class. And so we had the day laborers and the elites all joining together to participate in a civic organization, and they knew each other. And that is something that has become undone, that elites are only paying attention to elites, and non-elites are only paying attention to non-elites, and there's just not this connection. And that is our undoing.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the questions in the chat is kind of related to something that I had to ask as well, is that you had used the words false information, false claims. And does it make more sense for us to actually call out what we feel like are lies, or does that add to the disconnection between people?
There are people far more informed on exactly how to handle these situations than I. But so now sort of moving into my non-political science hat, but just more living in a classroom with students who are coming, how do you, so as a professor, I don't want my students to shut down. I don't want to say something in such a way that they're like, okay, forget it. I'm out of here. I'm not learning anymore because you have just made me feel terrible. So the question is, how can we engage? Do we say like, that's a lie and that's false? Sometimes publicly, I think it is reasonable to say that. But I think in other discussions, creating emotions of shame does not seem to me to be the best method to learning and understanding. It is creating a space where emotionally we can engage with things and not be made to feel stupid, but have ourselves open to being curious and questioning. And so I think it is not so much to say that's a lie, but to say, I'm curious why you think that. I want to know more. I have some other information I'd like to share, so that it is not an accusatory, legalistic conversation, but rather a conversation of developing mutual understanding.
Another question is, historically and even today in America, has voter suppression and obstacles to voting been objectively and significantly much more of an issue than voter fraud?
Absolutely. We have minimal cases of voter fraud. It is very hard to pull off voter fraud, and we have prosecuted people and done all that, but it's in the millions and millions and trillions of votes ever cast. The amount of voter fraud is very low. Voter suppression has been the name of the game since the founding of the Republic. That is something, and I want to say something. Well, I could say a lot about it, but one of the things to say about it is there have been, certainly overt voter suppression, the establishment of Jim Crow following the Civil War, all the way to the Voting Rights Act, and then all kinds of things in between. But let's think about also what happens on a regular basis in the in-between. And that is that, again, going back to who runs elections in the United States, it is partisans. And they have an interest, because the power that got them to where they are, they have an interest in maintaining that power. And so they are very skilled at creating rules that will continue to maintain their power and push people out. Any change to electoral rules, one always has to ask, like, what? Why are you doing that? Like, why are you moving elections to odd years instead of even years? Why are you having the election in August rather than May? I mean, whatever it is. And often it is because there are really good reasons for those partisans to realize that that is going to be a more effective mechanism to keep them in power. And they oppose changes precisely because they want to control who their voters are and keep out the people who are not going to vote for them. I teach both how to campaign and how to run for elective office, and I teach voting rights and election law. And I always say, like, that strategies are polar opposite. If you care about participation, that's one thing. If you're trying to run for office, you want to know who that community of people is who's going to support you and have tight control over it.
So what is when people say we should get rid of the Electoral College because it has, has not been in line with the popular vote for the last couple of decades. What do you say to that?
I think that's worth exploring. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that were baked in to the original Constitution that were there because it was necessary at the time for these compromises to happen in order to get the thing passed. That was the goal, was to get it passed. And so all kinds, in times of trying to get legislation passed, all kinds of deals are made. And a lot of the deals that were made at the time, or the results of those deals, are that we have institutions that are in some ways not what we in modern times think of as being small d democratic. And so it enables essentially a minority of people to win in whatever that is. So and this has implications across our institutions. So the Electoral College is one example where you can have this situation that is very hard to explain to kids, let alone adults. Yeah, more people voted for X, but because of this thing that we have, that person is not the winner. So there's just sort of this obvious challenge to it from if we think that the will of the people is what should carry the day. So that's problematic. Then you think about the United States Senate, which is the most malapportioned legislative body in the entire world, where you can have a situation where you have a Wyoming with about 500,000 people or fewer having 2 senators, and a California with millions of people and 2 senators. And I always say to my students, like, let's imagine that the classroom, the kindergarten classroom, like one classroom has 5 kids and 1 teacher, and another classroom has 50 kids and 1 teacher. Like, is that fair? Is that fair? Are the kids getting the same amount of education? And so in the sense of our United States Senate, are people getting the same representation? No, they are not. They are not. They are numerically and also just kind of, in the weeds, the raw represent the access that one has to one senator. You're more likely to be able to connect with your senator on a one-on-one level in Wyoming than you can in California. So that contributes to the Electoral College and to the power of the Electoral College. And then you have the Senate, which got to its place as it is today, and then they have this nomination power to the Supreme Court. And so we have the case where we have a Supreme Court that has 5 justices appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. So all of that leads to this issue of like, in this democracy that we have, and we have all of these institutions that are in some ways like not quite clearly the will of the bigger people. I think that's challenging.
Virginia says, if all investigations into voter fraud fail to produce anything valid, how can someone still claim fraud with no proof?
I just need to understand this. I need to say it again. If all of the investigations into fraud prove no fraud, right?
Yep.
Okay, then what?
But then people are still making claims.
The claims of fraud. Then what do you do?
Right.
You you continue to try to have the conversations about, I think, again, this is the part of like, okay, how do we have this conversation without shutting down, but have this conversation to say, can we think about this? Can we think about what goes into what is fraud? What is corruption? How would we know it? And those are long conversations. They're not anything you can essentially have in a one-time thing, but at the end of the day, as a political scientist, I'm always interested in like how people change and why they change and how minds change. And they don't change from facts being put up on a board. They change from really intense, open, curious conversations that enable thinking. So, and we have lots of examples of this on a lot of different issues. It's not easy. This is a long-term project.
Mm-hmm. And I think, in the chat, somebody said that claims require proof, but I'm curious about that in terms of the social media aspect that you had spoken about earlier, in that it is so easy to disseminate, lies, false information, false claims, all of that. And how do we, as like such a large population, all of us are being fed, false information. How do we like figure it out? You know, it's just constant.
Yeah, I know. And, you know, I don't have the answers to that. What I do know is I know more of the alarm bells to be raised rather than the way around it. But I'll give you an example of sort of an alarm bell, but also I do think this is something that we could find a way to address, and we're trying, and that is the decline of local news. That is such a problem because it means that at the most local level, the news isn't there to keep our elected officials accountable. So there could be all kinds of corruption happening, you know, outside my window, and I don't know it because I don't have that important press breathing down the necks of politicians to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But the other piece of that is, so that creates inefficiency. But then the other piece is that we don't have a common set of facts, and we don't have a common agreement about who is providing the facts. And in that light, then social media gets a lot more power because it's the only game in town. And so, you know, when there's a vacuum, somebody's going to fill it. So I think thinking about institutions that can really provide key information to us that we can all rally around and trust, and that, I mean, as I said, like that, probably everybody's saying like, good luck with that pie in the sky. I get it. But I don't, you know, if we don't have pie in the sky, we have no hope. So.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of questioning about like, how have we gotten to this place where people are consistently believing false information when it's been disproven in court? How do we get beyond that? The people that are so stuck in the way that they're thinking, or in such a silo that they can't see that.
Right, but they are in information bubbles and in these places that are walled off, and to some extent, all of us are. So we're all not really. That's why I say like a lot of it has to be more granular than big picture, because it's the connection that we've lost. The reason that any set of false information takes hold is that it's not met with countering opinions. And if that is not true, if things are not questioned, then you go down a rabbit hole. So you need those, in order to come out of that hole, we need to question, but we need to gather to question, to ask, but again, to be curious. So it's very, very hard, but the issue is it's so atomized. This information is so, as I said, in this time of such information, people are overwhelmed by it. It's a struggle. It's much easier to just stay with the things you now think you know than it is to change your mind, and that's a cognitive burden. And so how do we get into places and scenarios where we feel safe in order to be able to question? So as I said, these answers are so much more about, it's like, I'm not a psychologist. The psychologist in me is the one that the inner one is saying that that we have to put people in rooms together.
So this is not the first time that there's been, gerrymandering or, election or voter suppression and all of this, obviously with Jim Crow and things like that. And in the past, there hasn't been the social media as well. So how does this keep happening, every 50, 60 years? Because it's not happening only in the US, it's happening around the world right now. How does this keep happening? You can't just blame one thing. That's what I guess I'm saying.
Right. You can't just blame one thing, although I mean the impact of social media is enormous, and the thing that, for better or for worse, at least way back when, we had 3 news stations. We had standard newspapers. A lot of people subscribed to newspapers at the local level. There were these shared experiences, shared facts, and again, I am not lifting everything up as, paragons of perfection, because they all had their flaws and they all had their problems and they all had their misinformation there too. And yet, I think there's a lot of these feelings of like being in the twilight zone today, of like, oh my gosh, like I have never considered what you're thinking of, and you've never considered the world that I'm living in, and we live 5 miles apart, and yet we live in these totally separate worlds. So how is that possible? And so yes, things repeat themselves, but there is, I think, a substantial difference to today. And one approach is just these heavy duty regulation of social media companies. Of course, that bumps up against First Amendment, and that's really challenging. It also will take a long time to take hold. There's also all kinds of suggestions of the more education, more civics. Of course, I'm pro all of that. But it's got to be, I mean, I'm thinking things like national service and common experiences that people can have that transcend class and that transcend as much as we possibly can.
Do you think that the Supreme Court's rulings against campaign finance reform and in favor of gerrymandering have hurt democratic legitimacy?
I think that, yes, I do. The only reason I'm pausing is, and the gerrymandering has been around forever. and we have had, but we also have not really had the democracy that we imagine to have, I think, of a well-run, the will of the people kind of thing, has been elusive in the United States up until, I think, the Voting Rights Act really ensured that at that point everybody would, there was the force of the federal government and of the rule of law to protect people in fundamental ways that prior to the Voting Rights Act had not established. But prior to that, I mean, the other thing that happened in the 60s that really cannot be underestimated is this apportionment revolution, and the Supreme Court weighing in and saying that districts had to be equal in population size, because prior to that, they were not. And so we had literally almost no district in the United States was equal in the sense. And so this idea of one person, one vote really was something that didn't actually get enacted into law until then. So did we have democratic legitimacy prior to the Voting Rights Act? I mean, for all kinds of reasons, we can say no, 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 and no, or we can say, yeah, there were so many great things that happened long ago. So it's hard to say, have we lost or have we still not found? And then in the campaign finance reform, it has it is the role of money in elections cannot be underestimated. It has a huge impact. At the same time, there are plenty of examples of candidates who throw all kinds of money at their reelection campaigns and don't win. So, but they certainly have the power of voice and a louder voice than others do. And certainly campaign finance reform. But the thing I always want to say about campaign finance reform is that is a really important issue. And also it is a really important issue to look at the weeds of how the sausage is made and who has voice at every step along the way in policymaking processes, because there is money involved at all of those steps. And to really address the issues of the role of money and outsized influence, it's bigger than just elections.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think Jane has a really good point that sometimes it's important to get away from all of this, as you had said, like to not talk about politics, to get away from our devices, things like that. That would really help us, probably me, mentally and emotionally about a lot of these topics. Joyce says, do you feel like there are segments of society that feel no one listens to them, and that leads them to follow politicians that they feel hear what they're saying? And how do we engage with those people that are feeling isolated?
Well, yes, I do think a lot of people feel unheard and demobilized and disenfranchised. And I really, I see it. I'm gonna get to the latter part in a minute, but because I teach college students, and because college students don't vote at the same rate as over 65-year-olds, the politicians who I have had come into my classroom to talk about running for office and all of the good things that you can do, they are wonderful, and I love having them in my classroom. They also essentially use that emotion of shame with the students and say, like, you don't vote, you people don't take care of things, you're not active enough, you don't, whatever it is, they haven't done it, and they just turned 18. I'm almost like, this is kind of amazing that these people have gone from 0 and not being able to do anything to 18, and here they are expected to take on the world. It's a lot to ask them. And I think we should ask them, but I think we also can do it in a way where we're not blaming them, but inviting them into this system and helping them navigate how to be citizens, and helping them all along the way. So to our friends who are feeling disenfranchised, there are so many people who are using that language of shame. You don't know enough, you're not educated enough, you're whatever it is, you're not enough. And you are the cause of your own problems, rather than, how can I help? How can we help? How can we build this together? What does your community need? It's so basic, and yet leaders I have experienced classically don't go to the ground level to listen to the real needs and think about the real policies that could be enacted. So that leads to, what do we do? The only suggestion I have is we engage more. We run for office, we join our community groups, we connect with people, and before we blame and shame, we listen and ask.
Nice. So last question, given recent events, how do you feel about the future of democracy in this country?
I am nervous. I am really nervous. The trend lines are not in the direction that I want them to be going in. There is erosion of our democratic institutions, a loss of faith and a loss of confidence. And it's a lot easier to break those than to build them up. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's cynical me. But there are rays of hope, and but that really does require a lot of the hard work that I say, and it is. But the last thing we need is disengagement. So what I think is, I am nervous, but I am also heartened when I see the energy level, and frankly, the happiness of my students themselves, and their level of excitement to engage, and their level of, there are a lot of great organizations out there and a lot of great young people who are filled with hope. And when they're filled with hope, I'm filled with hope.
Oh, I think I might cry. Because there's days when you just don't feel that. And it's really nice to hear that on a Friday morning. Thank you.
Yeah.
So with that, I do thank you for being here with us again and helping us walk through this minefield, literally, of our emotions and this situation. Thank you, everybody, for being here and your thoughtful and insightful questions. And I will post this video on our YouTube channel and share it because I think it's so important that we all listen to it. So, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time out again to engage with me and our libraries.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure and super fun. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for the great questions. It was really a joy. Thank you.
Good night. Bye, everybody. Have a great
Good night.
weekend.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.